"It's just a stupid ceremony, Mom. Me going won't bring him back from the dead," my son Robert said, when he and his wife Jessica skipped my husband's funeral. 6 months later, when news of my unexpected inheritance reached him, he showed up at my door with his hand out. That's when I realized revenge could be served colder than a Minnesota winter. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. I'm Dorothy Miller, and 3 weeks ago, I buried my husband of 42 years completely alone. Not because I didn't have family, but because my only child decided his father's final goodbye wasn't worth his precious time. Robert had called me the morning of the service while I was pressing his father's Navy suit, the one Edward wore to our wedding. "Look, Mom, Jessica and I talked about it, and honestly, what's the point? Dad's gone. Standing around a grave listening to some preacher isn't going to change that." His voice carried that dismissive tone I'd grown to recognize over the years, the one that said my feelings were inconvenient obstacles to his logic. I'd stood there holding the phone with one hand and smoothing wrinkles from Edward's sleeve with the other, trying to process what I was hearing. "Robert, it's your father's funeral. People can expect whatever they want." He cut me off. "Jessica's got her book club thing today, and I've got that golf tournament I told you about. The entry fee was $300, Mom. I can't just throw that away." $300. That's what my husband's life was worth to his son, less than a round of golf. The funeral was beautiful, despite Robert's absence. Edward's Navy buddies formed an honor guard, and the church was packed with neighbors, co-workers, and friends who understood that showing up matters. But all I could see was the empty pew where my son should have been sitting. At the reception afterward, people kept asking where Robert was. I must have told 20 different lies. "He's flying in later," or "he had a work emergency." Each lie felt like swallowing glass, but the truth was too humiliating to speak aloud. That was 3 weeks ago. This morning, everything changed when I received a certified letter from Edward's attorney, revealing a secret my husband had kept for decades. And now, as I watch Robert's BMW pull into my driveway for the first time since Christmas, I can't help but smile. He has no idea what's coming. Robert knocked on my door at exactly 10:30, which told me this wasn't a social visit. Social visits don't require appointments, and they certainly don't happen on weekday mornings when normal people are at work. "Hi, Mom." He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, Jessica trailing behind him like she always did. She was clutching her designer purse so tightly, her knuckles were white and she wouldn't meet my eyes. "Guilty conscience, maybe?" "This is a surprise," I said, though it really wasn't. Word travels fast in small towns, and I'd been expecting this visit since yesterday when Edward's attorney mentioned he'd been getting calls. Robert settled himself in Edward's recliner without being asked, while Jessica perched nervously on the edge of the sofa. They both looked around the living room like they were cataloging everything, which probably wasn't far from the truth. "So," Robert began, clearing his throat, "I heard from Tom Stevenson that Dad's attorney has been trying to reach me about some paperwork." Tom Stevenson. Of course. Edward's old fishing buddy who couldn't keep his mouth shut if his life depended on it. I'd specifically asked Mr. Harrison to be discreet, but apparently that was too much to hope for in a town of 8,000 people. "Is that so?" I picked up my coffee cup and took a slow sip, letting him squirm a little. "What kind of paperwork?" Jessica shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Miller, we heard there might be some assets that need to be settled from Edward's estate. Assets, not grandfather's belongings or family inheritance. Assets like Edward was nothing more than a business transaction to be liquidated." "Well," I said carefully, "your father did leave some things behind, but I assumed you weren't interested in anything connected to him, considering you couldn't be bothered to attend his funeral." Robert's jaw tightened. "Mom, we've been through this. Jessica had commitments, and I had that tournament. It's not like Dad would have known if we were there or not." The casual cruelty of that statement hit me like a slap. 42 years of marriage, and this is what my son thought of his father's death. An inconvenience to be dismissed. You're right, I said quietly. Your father wouldn't have known, but I did, and so did everyone else who was there to honor a good man's life. Jessica spoke up, her voice artificially sweet. We're sorry if our absence upset you, Dorothy, but we're here now, and we want to help with whatever needs to be taken care of. Help. Another interesting word choice. They wanted to help themselves, more likely. Robert leaned forward in the chair, trying to look earnest. The thing is, Mom, Tom mentioned something about a trust, and some property Dad never told us about. There it was. The real reason for this sudden visit. Not concern for me, not belated grief for Edward, but money. Always money with these two. I set down my coffee cup and looked at my son, really looked at him. When had he become this stranger sitting in his father's chair? When had his eyes grown so cold, so calculating? Your father kept many things to himself, I said finally. Some of them might surprise you. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken questions. Robert and Jessica exchanged glances, and I could practically see the dollar signs dancing in their heads. Maybe, I continued, standing up and smoothing my skirt. We should discuss this at a more appropriate time. Say, when you're not treating this like a business meeting. Robert's mask slipped for just a moment. Mom, come on, don't be dramatic. We just want to understand what Dad left behind. Dramatic. That's what he called my grief, my disappointment, my hurt at being abandoned during the hardest day of my life. I think you should leave now, I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. When you're ready to have a real conversation about your father, one that includes respect for his memory, then we can talk about his legacy. They left, but not before Jessica shot me a look that could have curdled milk. As I watched their BMW disappear down the street, I pulled out the letter I'd received that morning and read it again. $23 million. That's what Edward had secretly accumulated over 4 decades of careful investing. $23 million that Robert had no idea existed. And after today's performance, I was beginning to think he never would. The phone started ringing at 7 the next morning. I let it go to voicemail while I made my breakfast, knowing exactly who it was and what they wanted. Robert's voice filled my kitchen when I finally played the message back. Mom, it's me. Look, maybe I came on a little strong yesterday. Jessica thinks we should talk this through properly. How about dinner Sunday? We'll cook. That was rich, considering Jessica's idea of cooking was heating up frozen dinners, and Robert couldn't boil water without burning it. But what really grated was the assumption that I'd just fall in line because they'd offered to feed me. I deleted the message and poured my coffee. Outside, Mrs. Henderson was walking her ancient beagle, the same route she'd taken every morning for the 15 years since her husband died. She waved when she saw me through the window, and I waved back, thinking about loyalty and consistency and all the things Robert seemed incapable of understanding. By noon, there had been 4 more calls. I didn't answer any of them. At 2 o'clock, Jessica showed up at my door with flowers and what I'm sure she thought was a contrite expression. Dorothy, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I felt terrible about yesterday. The flowers were supermarket carnations, the cheap kind they keep by the checkout counter. If she'd really felt terrible, she might have sprung for roses from the florist downtown. But Jessica had always been practical about her expenditures, especially when other people's feelings were involved. That's very thoughtful, I said, accepting the flowers but not inviting her in. I wasn't expecting company today. She shifted from foot to foot on my front porch, clearly hoping for an invitation that wasn't coming. I wanted to apologize for Robert. You know how he gets when he's stressed about money. Interesting. So this was about money problems. That explained the sudden interest in Edward's estate. Is Robert having financial difficulties? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Jessica's eyes widened slightly, realizing she'd said too much. "Oh no, nothing serious. Just the usual pressures, you know. The mortgage, car payments, Jessica's student loans from her master's degree. The master's degree in art history that had cost $60,000 and qualified her to work at the local art gallery for $12 an hour. Edward and I had warned them about taking on that much debt for such an impractical degree, but Jessica had insisted it was an investment in her future. "I see," I said. "Well, financial stress can certainly make people behave in ways they might later regret." She nodded eagerly, missing the subtle criticism in my words. "Exactly. Robert's been working so many hours lately, and we've been under so much pressure. When Tom mentioned that Edward might have left more than we expected, well, it just seemed like maybe things were looking up. There it was again. The assumption that Edward's death was somehow going to solve their problems, as if losing the man I'd loved for 42 years was offset by whatever financial benefit they might gain. "Jessica," I said quietly, "did it ever occur to you that attending Edward's funeral might have been more important than whatever temporary financial relief you're hoping for?" Her face flushed red. "Dorothy, it wasn't like that." "Wasn't it?" I stepped back toward my door. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like that. You couldn't be bothered to honor Edward's life when he had nothing left to give you, but now that there might be money involved, suddenly you want to be part of the family again. That's not fair." "What's not fair," I interrupted, "is burying your husband alone because your son values golf more than grief. What's not fair is making excuses for people who should have known better." I closed the door before she could respond, then watched through the window as she stood on my porch for a full minute, probably trying to decide whether to ring the bell again. Finally, she walked back to her car, clutching those pathetic carnations. My phone rang again an hour later. This time it was Robert, and his patience had clearly worn thin. "Mom, what the hell is wrong with you? Jessica said you were completely unreasonable to her. She was trying to apologize." "Your wife was fishing for information," I said calmly. "There's a difference. Look, I get that you're upset about the funeral, but you can't punish us forever. We're family. Family." The word had lost all meaning coming from him. "Robert, let me ask you something. If your father had died penniless, would you be calling me right now?" The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. "That's what I thought," I said, and hung up. That evening, I sat in Edward's study reading through the investment portfolios his attorney had given me. $23 million accumulated through decades of careful stock picks and real estate investments. Money that could have made Robert and Jessica's financial problems disappear in an instant. But as I looked at the photograph of Edward on his desk, the one taken at our wedding where he was looking at me like I hung the moon, I made a decision that would have made my husband proud. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. By Friday, the whole town was talking. I knew this because Margaret from the post office called to warn me that Robert had been in asking questions about certified mail deliveries to my address. Apparently, he'd tried to charm her into giving him information about what I'd been receiving, forgetting that Margaret had known him since he was in diapers and wasn't impressed by his smooth talk. "That boy's up to something, Dorothy," she said, her voice crackling through my old kitchen phone. He had that look in his eye, the same one he used to get when he was planning to sneak out of Sunday school. I thanked Margaret and hung up, not entirely surprised by Robert's detective work. When money was involved, my son could be remarkably resourceful. What surprised me was how little he understood about small-town loyalty. Margaret had been Edward's friend for 30 years. If Robert thought she'd betray my privacy for his benefit, he really didn't know the people who'd raised him. Saturday morning brought Jessica again, this time with what looked like homemade cookies, but smelled suspiciously like the ones from the bakery section at Miller's Market. She was dressed more casually than usual, jeans and a sweater instead of her typical designer outfits, probably trying to look relatable and non-threatening. "I brought these for you," she said, holding out the container with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Robert's grandmother's recipe. That was particularly galling since Robert's grandmother had been dead for 15 years and Jessica had never shown the slightest interest in her recipes when the woman was alive. But I accepted the cookies graciously and invited her in for coffee, curious to see what new strategy they'd devised. She settled at my kitchen table and looked around with what I assumed was meant to be admiration. "You've kept everything so nice, Dorothy. Edward would be pleased." "I hope so," I said, filling the coffee pot. "He loved this house. Robert and I were talking about that," Jessica said carefully, "about how much work it must be for you to maintain such a big place all by yourself." Here we go, I thought. The concerned daughter-in-law routine, complete with helpful suggestions about downsizing. "It's manageable," I said. "I've been thinking about making some changes, though, maybe updating a few things." Jessica perked up noticeably. "Oh, that's exciting. Are you thinking about renovating? Because Robert knows this great contractor who could give you a good deal." Of course he did. Robert always knew someone who could give me a good deal, usually someone who would kick back a percentage to him for the referral. "Actually," I said, pouring coffee into 2 mugs, "I've been considering something more dramatic, maybe selling and moving somewhere warmer." The cup in Jessica's hand trembled slightly. "Selling? But Dorothy, this house has been in Edward's family for generations. Surely you wouldn't want to let it go to strangers." "Edward left the house to me," I said evenly, "which means I can do whatever I think is best." Of course. I just meant, well, Robert always assumed he'd inherit this place eventually. He's got so many memories here." Memories? That was interesting. Considering Robert had visited maybe 6 times in the past 5 years, and half of those were holidays, when he spent most of his time complaining about the outdated kitchen and unreliable Wi-Fi. "Robert will have to make his own memories in his own house," I said. "This one belongs to me now." Jessica took a sip of coffee, clearly regrouping. "You know, Dorothy, I've been thinking about Edward's funeral. Robert feels terrible about missing it. He's been talking about doing something special to honor his father's memory." "Such as?" "Well, maybe a memorial service? Something more personal, just for family? It might help with the healing process." The healing process. As if grief was something that could be scheduled and managed, like a dental appointment. "That's a lovely thought," I said. "But I think Edward was honored quite well by the people who actually cared enough to attend his funeral." Jessica flinched. "Robert did care, Dorothy. He doesn't handle death well. You know how men can be about emotions." "Edward was a man," I pointed out. "He handled death just fine when his own father passed. He understood that some obligations transcend personal discomfort." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock Edward had brought back from Germany after his Navy service. Jessica stared into her coffee cup like it might provide her with better arguments. "Is there something specific you wanted to discuss?" I asked finally. "Because I have groceries to pick up this afternoon." She looked up, and for a moment I saw something almost like desperation in her eyes. "Dorothy, I'm going to be honest with you. Robert and I are struggling financially. We've made some poor decisions, taken on too much debt. When we heard that Edward might have left more than we expected, well, it felt like maybe there was hope. Finally. The truth, or at least part of it. I appreciate your honesty," I said. "But I have to ask, if Robert had attended his father's funeral, if he'd shown even the slightest respect for Edward's memory, would you still be here asking for money?" Jessica's face crumpled. "Probably not," she whispered. "Then you understand why this conversation is so difficult for me." She nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. Real tears this time, not the manufactured ones she'd tried earlier. "What would it take," she asked, "for you to forgive him?" I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Edward had spent years perfecting. "That's not the right question, Jessica. The question is, what would it take for Robert to forgive himself?" When I turned back around, She was gone, leaving only the container of store-bought cookies and the lingering scent of desperation. That evening, I called Edward's attorney and scheduled an appointment for Monday morning. It was time to start putting my plan into motion. The law office of Harrison, Mitchell and Associates occupied a converted Victorian house on Main Street, the same building where Edward and I had signed our first mortgage 40 years ago. Mr. Harrison himself was third-generation Millerville, a man who understood that some things mattered more than money, though he was certainly skilled at managing both. "Dorothy," he said, rising from behind his mahogany desk as his secretary showed me in, "I'm so sorry again for your loss. Edward was a good man." "He was," I agreed, settling into the leather chair across from him, "which is why I want to make sure his legacy is handled properly." Mr. Harrison opened the thick file containing Edward's estate documents. I have to say, I was surprised when Edward first came to me about setting up the trust structure. Most people don't go to such elaborate lengths to keep their assets private. "Edward was always a planner," I said. "He worried about what would happen to me if something happened to him. I think he wanted to make sure I had options." "Well, he certainly gave you those." Mr. Harrison pulled out a summary sheet. "The $23 million is divided across several investment accounts, plus the real estate holdings in Colorado and Florida. All of it held in trust with you as the sole beneficiary and complete discretionary control. $23 million. Even hearing it again, the number seemed surreal. Edward had been so careful with money throughout our marriage, clipping coupons and watching every expense. I'd had no idea he was accumulating this kind of wealth. "There's something else," Mr. Harrison continued. "Edward left specific instructions about what should happen if Robert ever contested the will or tried to claim inheritance rights." "What kind of instructions?" He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Edward's familiar handwriting. "He asked me to give you this if the situation arose. He was very specific about the circumstances." I opened the envelope with trembling fingers and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Edward's words, written in his careful script, brought tears to my eyes. "My darling Dorothy, if you're reading this, it means our son has revealed his true character in the face of loss. I've watched Robert become someone I don't recognize, someone who values what he can get over what he can give. Don't let him make you feel guilty for protecting what we built together. You earned every penny of this money through 42 years of love, partnership, and sacrifice. Use it wisely, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. All my love, Edward." I wiped my eyes and looked up at Mr. Harrison. "Did Edward ever explain why he kept this secret from me?" "He said he wanted you to be genuinely surprised when Robert showed his hand. He felt that your reaction would be more authentic if you weren't prepared for it." Mr. Harrison leaned back in his chair. "I think he was testing Robert, hoping his son would prove him wrong. And if Robert had attended the funeral? If he'd shown respect for his father's memory? Edward left provisions for that too. There's a separate letter with instructions for a more generous distribution if Robert demonstrated genuine grief and support for you. But Robert hadn't demonstrated those things. Instead, he'd chosen golf and his wife's book club over his father's final goodbye. I'd like to make some changes to the trust structure," I said, "and I want to set up a meeting with Robert. It's time he learned the truth about his father's estate." Mr. Harrison raised an eyebrow. "All of it?" "Not exactly." I smiled, thinking about the conversation I was about to have with my son. "Let's say I want to share enough truth to be educational." We spent the next hour going over the details of my plan. When I left the office, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. Edward had given me the tools to teach Robert an important lesson, but using them would mean accepting that the son I'd raised was truly gone, replaced by this stranger who valued money over family. That afternoon, I called Robert and invited him and Jessica for dinner Sunday evening. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your father's estate," I told him. "Finally," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. Jessica and I will be there at 6. Actually, I'd prefer to speak with you alone first. Jessica can join us for dessert." There was a pause. "Mom, we don't keep secrets from each other. Whatever you tell me, I'm going to share with my wife." "That's your choice," I said. "But the initial conversation will be between you and me. Those are my terms." He agreed, probably figuring he could handle one elderly widow better than two. Poor Robert. He had no idea what he was walking into. I spent Saturday preparing Edward's favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables, homemade dinner rolls, and apple pie. Not because I thought Robert deserved it, but because I wanted Edward's presence to be felt during our conversation. This was his plan, his final attempt to reach the son who disappointed him so deeply. Sunday morning, I dressed in the navy blue suit Edward had always said brought out my eyes, and I put on the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 25th anniversary. If I was going to destroy my relationship with my son, I wanted to look my best doing it. At exactly 6 o'clock, Robert knocked on my door. He was alone, as requested, and carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than he could afford. Another attempt to soften me up, I assumed. "Something smells amazing," he said, kissing my cheek with what seemed like genuine affection. For a moment, I almost wavered in my resolve. This was still my son, the little boy who'd brought me dandelions and called them flowers. But then I remembered standing alone at Edward's graveside, and my determination returned. "Let's eat first," I said. "We can discuss business afterward." Dinner was pleasant, almost normal. Robert complimented the food and told me about his work, carefully avoiding any mention of money or inheritance. He was trying so hard to be the perfect son that it almost broke my heart. After we finished the apple pie, I poured coffee and finally broached the subject that had brought him here. "Your father did leave more than I initially told you," I began. Robert's eyes lit up with an emotion I'd learned to recognize: greed. "How much more?" Robert asked, setting down his coffee cup with hands that weren't quite steady. I pulled out a folder Mr. Harrison had prepared for me, containing carefully selected documents that told part of the story without revealing the full scope of Edward's wealth. "Your father had been investing for years without my knowledge," I said, handing him a statement showing one of the smaller accounts. "This is what I discovered when I met with his attorney." Robert's eyes widened as he scanned the numbers. $300,000. To him, it probably seemed like a fortune. He had no idea it represented less than 2% of what Edward had actually left behind. 300,000? His voice was barely a whisper. "Dad never said anything about having this kind of money. Your father was a private man about finances," I said. "Even I didn't know about these investments until after he died." Robert was quiet for a long moment, probably calculating how much of that money he thought he deserved. When he looked up, I saw the same expression I'd seen on his face as a child when he wanted something badly. "Mom, this changes everything. With this money, you could hire help for the house, maybe travel, live more comfortably. And Jessica and I, well, we could really use some help with our debts." There it was, not even 5 minutes after learning about the money, and he was already planning how to spend it. "Actually, Robert, there's something we need to discuss about that." I pulled out another document, this one showing the trust structure Mr. Harrison had explained to me. "This money isn't just sitting in a bank account. Your father set up a complex trust, and there are conditions attached to any distributions." Robert's face fell. "What kind of conditions?" "Well, for one thing, any potential heirs must demonstrate what Edward called family commitment and moral character." I was improvising now, but it felt right. He was very specific about what that meant. "Such as?" I looked at my son directly, seeing Edward's eyes in his face, but none of Edward's character. "Such as honoring family obligations, showing respect for family members, both living and deceased, putting family above personal convenience." Robert had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Mom, if this is about the funeral again, it's about everything." Robert, the funeral was just the final example of a pattern your father had been watching for years. I pulled out Edward's letter and read it aloud, watching Robert's face change as he heard his father's words. When I finished, the silence in the kitchen was deafening. "So what are you saying?" Robert asked finally. "That I don't get anything because I missed Dad's funeral? I'm saying that your father left very clear instructions about how this money should be distributed, and those instructions take into account the kind of person the recipient has proven themselves to be." Robert stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the kitchen floor. "This is ridiculous. I'm his son. I have rights." "You have the rights your father chose to give you," I said calmly, "which, based on your behavior, weren't many." "My behavior?" His voice rose. "What about your behavior? You're using Dad's death to manipulate me, to punish me for making one mistake." "One mistake?" I stood up too, my own anger finally breaking through. "Robert, you abandoned me on the worst day of my life. You chose golf over your father's funeral. You've shown up here twice in 6 months, and both times it was because you wanted something. And now you have the audacity to claim you're being treated unfairly. I'm your son. Then act like it." The words came out louder than I intended, echoing off the kitchen walls. "Act like someone who deserves to inherit what your father spent 40 years building. Show me the man Edward hoped you'd become instead of the disappointment you've turned into." Robert stared at me, his face flushed with anger, and something that might have been shame. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to prove that you're capable of putting someone else's needs before your own. I want you to show me that family means more to you than money. I want you to demonstrate the values your father tried to teach you." "And if I do that?" I sat back down, suddenly feeling every one of my 71 years. "Then we'll see what your father's trust allows for." Robert sank back into his chair, his anger deflating into something that looked almost like desperation. "Mom, I need this money. We're in serious trouble financially. If I don't get some help soon, we could lose the house." For a moment, I felt the old maternal instinct kick in, the desire to fix his problems and make everything better. But then I remembered Edward's words. "Don't let him make you feel guilty for protecting what we built together. Then I suggest you figure out how to earn it," I said quietly. The front door opened, and Jessica's voice called out, "Hello? Are we ready for dessert?" She appeared in the kitchen doorway, took one look at Robert's face, and immediately tensed. "Is everything okay? Your husband just learned that inheriting money requires more than just showing up," I said, standing to clear the coffee cups. "Perhaps you'd like to discuss what that might mean on your way home." They left shortly after, Jessica's questions following them out to their car. I watched from the window as they sat in my driveway for nearly 10 minutes, Robert gesticulating wildly while Jessica listened with growing alarm. After they drove away, I sat in Edward's recliner and looked at the photograph on the side table, the one of us dancing at our wedding. We'd been so young, so full of hope for the future and the family we'd build together. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," I whispered to his image. "I hope this is what you wanted." The house was quiet, except for the old clock ticking in the hallway, but somehow I felt Edward's presence more strongly than I had since the day he died. He'd given me the tools to teach Robert an important lesson, but the hardest part was just beginning. Tomorrow, I would wait to see if my son was capable of change, or if I'd have to accept that the boy I'd raised was truly gone forever. In 3 days, Robert would make a choice that would determine not just his inheritance, but the future of our relationship. And for the first time since Edward's death, I felt something that might have been hope. 3 days passed without a word from Robert. I spent them organizing Edward's papers and trying not to jump every time the phone rang. On Wednesday morning, I was watering the petunias Edward had planted when I saw Robert's car pull up. This time, he was alone. He looked terrible. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled like he'd slept in them. When he knocked on the door, there was none of his usual confident swagger. "Mom, can we talk?" I invited him in and made coffee while he sat at the kitchen table, staring at his hands. The silence stretched between us until finally he spoke. Jessica left me yesterday. I paused in pouring the coffee. I'm sorry to hear that. She said she couldn't handle the uncertainty about the money, said she didn't sign up to be married to someone who might never inherit anything. His laugh was bitter. Turns out she really didn't marry me for my sparkling personality. For the first time since Edward's funeral, I felt genuine sympathy for my son. That must be very painful. The thing is, Mom, losing her made me realize something. When I called to tell her about the trust conditions, the first thing she said was, "How are we going to fix this?" Not, "How are you feeling?" or, "I'm sorry this is difficult." Just straight to problem-solving mode. I sat down across from him, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "And how did that make you feel? Like maybe I've been looking at everything wrong?" He met my eyes for the first time, including what happened with Dad's funeral. Here it was, the moment Edward had been hoping for. "I've been thinking about that day," Robert continued, "about why I really didn't come. And the truth is, it wasn't about the golf tournament or Jessica's book club. It was because I was scared. Scared of what? Scared of having to face the fact that Dad was really gone. Scared of having to be strong for you when I felt like I was falling apart. It was easier to just not deal with it." I reached across the table and touched his hand. "Robert, grief is scary, but running away from it doesn't make it disappear. I know that now, and I know I let you down when you needed me most." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I wasn't there for Dad's funeral. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. I'm sorry I only showed up when I thought there was money involved." These were the words I'd been waiting to hear for months, but I needed to be sure they were genuine. "What changed your mind? Was it Jessica leaving, or was it something else?" Robert was quiet for a long moment. "Yesterday I went to Dad's grave. First time since he died. I sat there for 2 hours, and I realized I've been angry at him for dying and leaving me to figure out how to be a man without his guidance. But the truth is, he spent 40 years trying to teach me, and I just wasn't listening." He pulled out a small object from his pocket, Edward's Navy compass, the one he'd carried through 3 deployments. "I found this in my old room upstairs. Dad gave it to me when I turned 18, said it would help me find my way when I felt lost." Robert's fingers traced the worn brass surface. "I think I've been lost for a very long time." I felt tears starting to form. This was the son I remembered, the thoughtful boy who'd gotten buried under years of entitlement and poor choices. "What do you want to do now?" I asked. "I want to earn whatever inheritance Dad thought I deserved. Not because I need the money, though God knows I do, but because I want to prove I'm worthy of being his son." That afternoon, we drove to the cemetery together. Robert knelt beside Edward's headstone and spoke to his father for the first time since the funeral he'd missed. I couldn't hear all the words, but I saw my son's shoulders shake with grief he'd been holding back for months. When we got home, I made the decision Edward had been hoping I'd make. "Robert, there's something else about your father's estate that you need to know." I led Robert into Edward's study and pulled out the complete financial portfolio Mr. Harrison had prepared. His eyes widened as he saw the real numbers, not 300,000, but $23 million. "This is what your father actually left behind," I said quietly. Robert stared at the documents in shock. "23 million? But you said—" "I said there was money. I didn't say how much." I sat down in Edward's desk chair. "Your father set up this elaborate test because he wanted to know if you could value family over money. The small amount I showed you was to see what you'd do when you thought that was all there was. And I failed the test spectacularly," Robert said, sinking into the chair across from me. "The first time, yes, but Edward built in a second chance. He hoped that if you were confronted with the consequences of your choices, you might find your way back to the man he raised you to be." Robert looked around the study, taking in the photographs of our family, The books Edward had read, the model ships he'd built with patient hands. What happens now? Now you have a choice to make, I said. Your father's will allows for several different distributions, depending on circumstances. There's the full inheritance if you prove yourself worthy. There's a modest inheritance if you show some growth, but still need work. And there's nothing if you remain the person you've been. What would I have to do to prove myself worthy? I pulled out Edward's letter with his specific instructions. Your father was very clear about this. He wanted you to spend 1 year demonstrating that you understand the values he tried to teach you: responsibility, service to others, putting family above personal gain. 1 year doing what? Whatever it takes to show that you've learned from your mistakes. Your father suggested several possibilities: volunteer work, taking care of me without expectation of reward, proving you can hold a job and manage money responsibly. Robert was quiet for several minutes, processing everything. And if I do these things, if I prove myself, then what? Then you inherit everything. The full 23 million, the properties, all of it. I paused. But Robert, you need to understand something. This isn't about the money anymore. This is about whether you can become the man your father believed you could be. What if I can't? What if I'm too set in my ways to change? I smiled sadly. Then you'll have learned something valuable about yourself. And I'll know that your father's money should go to people who will use it to make the world better. That evening, Robert helped me prepare dinner, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. We worked in comfortable silence, and I found myself remembering the boy who used to stand on a step stool to help me stir cookie dough. "Mom," he said as we sat down to eat, "I want to try. I want to do whatever it takes to earn Dad's respect, even if it's too late for him to see it." "It's not too late," I said firmly. "Love doesn't end with death, Robert. Your father is still hoping you'll find your way." The next morning, Robert moved back into his childhood bedroom. Having lost the house he and Jessica could never afford anyway. He got a job at Morrison's Hardware, working for minimum wage and learning what it meant to earn an honest living. It wasn't easy. There were days when his pride chafed at taking orders from men who'd known him since childhood. There were nights when he came home exhausted and discouraged. But slowly, steadily, he began to change. He started volunteering at the food bank on weekends. He took over the yard work I'd been struggling with. He drove me to doctor's appointments and grocery shopping, never asking for gas money or acting like it was an imposition. Most importantly, he began talking about Edward not as someone who'd withheld money from him, but as a father whose love he was finally learning to appreciate. 6 months into his year of proving himself, we received unexpected news that would test Robert's transformation in ways neither of us had anticipated. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Robert was getting ready for work. Jessica's voice on the phone was different, smaller, more vulnerable than I'd ever heard it. "Dorothy, I need to talk to you and Robert. It's important." She arrived an hour later, visibly pregnant and clearly struggling financially. Her designer clothes had been replaced with discount store outfits, and she looked like she'd been crying. "I'm 4 months along," she said without preamble. "And before you ask, yes, it's Robert's baby." Robert sat heavily in the kitchen chair, his face pale. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I was hoping I could handle this on my own. But I can't afford prenatal care. And I'm scared." Jessica looked between us with desperate eyes. "I know I have no right to ask for help after the way I treated both of you, but this baby needs medical attention." I watched Robert carefully, seeing him wrestle with conflicting emotions. The old Robert would have seen this as an opportunity to guilt me into giving him money. The new Robert was clearly torn between his hurt over Jessica's abandonment and his concern for his unborn child. "What do you need?" he asked quietly. "I need help with medical bills, and I need to know, is there any chance we could try again? I know I messed up, but maybe if the money situation gets resolved." There it was. Even in desperation, Jessica was still calculating the financial angles. Robert looked at me, then back at Jessica. The money situation isn't going to be resolved anytime soon. I'm working at the hardware store for $8.50 an hour, and I'm living in my childhood bedroom. If you're looking for a meal ticket, you're looking at the wrong guy. But your mother's inheritance isn't mine, Robert said firmly. And even if it was, I wouldn't use it to buy back a wife who left me the minute things got difficult. Jessica's face crumpled. Robert, please. I was scared and stupid, but I love you. Do you? Or do you love what you thought I could provide for you? It was a fair question. And Jessica's inability to answer it immediately told us everything we needed to know. Here's what I'll do, Robert said after a long pause. I'll help with the medical bills because this baby is my responsibility too. But that's it. If you want more than that, you'll have to prove you're capable of loving me when I have nothing to offer but myself. After Jessica left, Robert and I sat in the kitchen processing what had just happened. That was well handled, I told him. It hurt like hell, he admitted. Part of me wanted to tell her everything about Dad's money to win her back with the promise of financial security. What stopped you? Dad's compass. He pulled it from his pocket. I've been carrying it every day, and whenever I'm tempted to take the easy way out, I remember what he taught me about doing the right thing even when it's hard. Over the following weeks, Robert proved his words with actions. He set aside money from his small paycheck for Jessica's medical bills, even though it meant he couldn't afford new work boots when his old ones wore through. He never mentioned the larger inheritance, never used it as leverage to try to win her back. When Jessica realized that Robert truly had no access to immediate wealth, she stopped calling. The divorce papers arrived a month later, along with a demand that Robert sign away his parental rights in exchange for her not seeking child support. Robert brought the papers to me, his hands shaking with anger. She wants me to abandon my child the same way I abandoned Dad, he said. She thinks if she can't get money from me, she might as well cut me out entirely. What are you going to do? I'm going to fight for my rights as a father. This baby deserves better than a parent who sees children as bargaining chips. He tore up the papers. Even if I never get a penny of Dad's inheritance, I won't let my child grow up thinking their father didn't want them. That night, I called Mr. Harrison and told him to prepare the papers for Robert's full inheritance. Edward's year-long test was effectively over. My son had proven himself in the most important way possible. He'd chosen love over money, responsibility over convenience, and the hard right over the easy wrong. But I decided to wait a little longer before telling him. There was one more lesson Edward had wanted to teach, and it required Robert to keep believing that his good choices might never be rewarded. Robert's fight for his parental rights lasted 3 months and cost him every penny he'd saved from his hardware store job. He borrowed money from friends, worked overtime whenever possible, and even sold his golf clubs, the same clubs he'd used in the tournament that had kept him from Edward's funeral. I offered to help with legal fees multiple times, but Robert refused. This is my responsibility, Mom. I got myself into this mess by marrying someone I didn't really know. I need to get myself out of it. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in November. Robert had managed to scrape together enough money for a decent lawyer, though I could see the stress was wearing on him. He'd lost weight, and there were permanent worry lines around his eyes. The night before the hearing, we sat in Edward's study going over his testimony one more time. What if I lose? Robert asked. What if the judge decides Jessica's right, that I'm too financially unstable to be a father? Then you'll appeal, and you'll keep fighting until you win, I said firmly, because that's what fathers do. Even fathers who've made as many mistakes as I have, especially fathers who've learned from their mistakes. The hearing was brutal. Jessica's lawyer painted Robert as an irresponsible man-child who'd never held a steady job and was currently living with his mother. They brought up his absence from Edward's funeral as evidence of his poor character and inability to handle responsibility. Robert's lawyer countered by showing the judge documentation of Robert's volunteer work, his steady employment for the past 8 months, and character references from his boss and co-workers. Most importantly, Robert testified about his own childhood and how much having an involved father had meant to him. "Your Honor," Robert said, his voice steady despite his nervousness, "I know I've made mistakes. I know I haven't always been the man my father raised me to be. But this child will never doubt that they're wanted and loved. I will be there for every birthday, every school play, every difficult moment. I will be the father my own father taught me to be." The judge took 2 weeks to make his decision. During that time, Robert continued working, continued volunteering, continued proving every day that he'd genuinely changed. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Robert had been granted joint custody, with the child spending equal time with both parents once they were old enough for overnight visits. Until then, he would have supervised visitation rights and would share in all major decisions about the child's upbringing. Robert cried when he hung up the phone. 43 years old, and I don't think I'd seen him cry since he was 8 and broke his arm falling out of the apple tree in our backyard. "I'm going to be a father," he said, wonder and terror mixing in his voice. "You already are a father," I corrected him. "Now you're going to get the chance to prove it." That evening, I made Robert's favorite dinner and opened a bottle of wine Edward had been saving for a special occasion. As we ate, I watched my son talk about his plans for the nursery he'd set up in his childhood room, about the books he wanted to read to his child, about the values he hoped to pass on. This was the man Edward had always believed Robert could become. After dinner, I led Robert back to Edward's study and handed him a final envelope I'd been keeping in the desk drawer. "What's this?" he asked. "Your father's final letter, the one he wrote for you to read after you'd proven yourself worthy of his trust." Robert opened it with trembling hands and read silently, tears streaming down his face. When he finished, he looked up at me with Edward's eyes, but finally with Edward's character shining through them. "He knew," Robert whispered. "Somehow he knew that becoming a father myself would be what finally made me understand what I'd lost when I chose golf over his funeral." "Your father understood you better than you understood yourself," I said. "He also loved you more than you ever gave him credit for." "What happens now, Mom?" I smiled and pulled out the inheritance papers Mr. Harrison had prepared months ago. "Now you become the man your father always knew you could be, and you do it with $23 million to help you make the world a better place." 6 months later, I stood in the nursery Robert had created in what used to be Edward's workshop, watching my son read "Goodnight Moon" to his daughter Emma. She was beautiful, with Robert's dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold the promise of all the wisdom she'd gain from a father who'd learned the hard way how to be a good man. The money had changed our lives, but not in the ways I'd expected. Robert had quit his job at the hardware store, but only after giving 2 weeks' notice and training his replacement. He'd bought a modest house 3 blocks from mine, close enough that I could help with Emma, but far enough that he could establish his independence. Most of the inheritance had gone into a foundation Edward had outlined in his final letters, one focused on helping struggling families stay together and supporting single parents who were working to better their lives. Robert managed it with the same careful attention to detail he'd learned from watching Edward, and the same humility he'd gained from his year of minimum wage work. "She's asleep," Robert whispered, carefully placing Emma in her crib. "Amazing how someone so small can completely change your perspective on everything." "That's what children do," I said, smoothing the baby's blanket. "They show you what really matters." We walked back to the kitchen, where Robert made coffee, and I admired the family photos covering his refrigerator. Pictures of Emma, pictures of the 3 of us together, and in the place of honor, the last photo ever taken of Edward, at Robert's graduation from the parenting classes he'd insisted on taking. "Do you think Dad would be proud?" Robert asked, settling into the chair across from me. "I think he's been proud of you every day since you chose to fight for your daughter instead of taking the easy way out," I said. "But I think he'd be especially proud to see you using his money to help other families stay together. Sometimes I wish I could thank him for the test, for the money, for believing I could become better than I was." I reached across the table and squeezed Robert's hand. "You can thank him by being the father to Emma that he was to you, by teaching her the values he tried to teach you, by showing her that people can change, that mistakes don't have to define us, and that family is the most important thing we'll ever have." Robert nodded, understanding passing between us without words. That night, as I drove home through the familiar streets of our small town, I thought about Edward and the elaborate plan he'd devised to save our son. It had worked, but not without cost. The year of testing had been painful for all of us, and there were moments when I'd wondered if I was being cruel instead of loving. But as I pulled into my driveway and saw the lights still on in Robert's house down the street, as I imagined him checking on Emma one more time before bed, I knew Edward had been right. Some lessons can only be learned through experience, and some gifts are only appreciated by those who've proven themselves worthy of receiving them. The hidden fortune hadn't just been about money. It had been about hidden strength, hidden character, and the hidden capacity for change that exists in all of us. Edward had gambled everything on his belief that the son he'd raised was still there, buried under years of entitlement and poor choices. He'd won that gamble, and in doing so, he'd given us all something more valuable than $23 million. He'd given us back our family. As I settled into Edward's recliner with a cup of tea, I could swear I heard his voice on the evening breeze, carried through the open window from the garden he'd loved. "Well done, Dorothy. Well done." Outside